You're a 17-year-old girl standing in the most luxurious palace in the world. Servants drape you in silks worth more than entire kingdoms. Your father commands 3 continents and millions of souls. You are Ottoman royalty, a princess of the mightiest empire on earth. But as the sun sets on your wedding day, you whisper words that chill the blood. This is not my wedding. This is my funeral. These weren't the desperate words of some powerless medieval bride. These were the thoughts of Makrima Sultan, daughter of Suleiman the Magnificent, spoken on what should have been the happiest day of her life. She possessed rights that European princesses could only dream of. She could refuse her husband's advances indefinitely. She outranked him completely. She commanded her own household, her own wealth, her own destiny. Yet she stood there 17 years old, comparing her marriage to death itself. What could make the most privileged women in the Ottoman Empire dread their wedding nights more than execution? The answer lies in a system so complex, so psychologically devastating, that it turned imperial marriage into a form of elegant torture. These weren't just political arrangements, they were calculated destructions of human agency disguised as royal ceremony. What we're about to uncover comes from palace records, personal letters, and historical accounts that reveal how the Ottoman Empire's marriage customs created a unique form of psychological warfare against its own daughters. If you're fascinated by the dark secrets of imperial history, consider subscribing and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. It helps us create more content like this. Now, let's discover why being born an Ottoman princess meant a lifetime of dreading what others considered blessed events. The Ottoman Empire's approach to royal marriage wasn't just different from European customs. It was deliberately designed to maximize political utility while minimizing personal agency. Unlike European kingdoms, where princesses might at least know their intended husbands, Ottoman princesses often learned about their marriages only days before the ceremony. The selection process operated with bureaucratic efficiency that treated human emotion as an inconvenient variable to be managed. Palace records show that marriage negotiations for imperial daughters began when they reached age 12, sometimes earlier, but the girls themselves remained completely excluded from these discussions. Their fathers, brothers, or the Valida Sultan made decisions based on military alliances, trade agreements, and administrative needs. The princess's personality, preferences, or compatibility with her intended husband never entered the calculations. They were strategic assets to be deployed when politically advantageous. The men selected as husbands came from a very specific pool. Most were products of the Devshirme system. Christian boys taken from their families as children, converted to Islam, and trained for imperial service. These men owed everything to the Sultan's favor. They had no independent power base, no family connections, no identity beyond what the empire had created for them. They were perfect husbands for imperial daughters because they could never threaten the dynasty's supremacy. But this created a psychological nightmare for the princesses. They were being married to men who were essentially imperial servants, elevated to husband status through political necessity. These weren't romantic partnerships or even respectful alliances between equals. They were formalized relationships between imperial property, the princess, and imperial employees, the husband. The wedding night represented the moment when this cold political calculation became intimate reality. Consider the case of Aishi Sultan, daughter of Ahmed III, who was given in marriage to Nasu Pasha when she was only 6 years old. The marriage contract was signed, the ceremonies performed, but consummation was delayed until she reached 12. Think about the psychological impact of this arrangement. For 6 years, this child lived with the knowledge that she belonged to a man old enough to be her grandfather. Every birthday brought her closer to a wedding night she had never chosen. With a husband, she had been assigned like a piece of furniture. The palace maintained detailed records of these arrangements, treating them with the same administrative precision used for tax collection or military supplies. Marriage contracts specified not just dowries and ceremonies, but timelines for consummation, pregnancy expectations, and inheritance provisions for potential children. The princesses existed within a framework where their most intimate experiences were subject to imperial scheduling and bureaucratic oversight. Even when princesses reached the age of consummation, the psychological torture continued through the elaborate ritual preparations. The wedding ceremonies themselves lasted for weeks, with each day bringing the inevitable closer. Palace historians describe these celebrations in glowing terms, emphasizing the magnificence of the costumes, the generosity of the gifts, the splendor of the entertainment. But surviving personal accounts from the princesses tell a different story entirely. The preparation rituals were designed to transform girls into wives through a process that resembled religious conversion more than celebration. Princesses underwent ceremonial baths, religious instruction about wifely duties, and formal presentations to court officials who would evaluate their readiness for marriage. These weren't joyful traditions. They were systematic procedures for processing royal daughters into marital compliance. The most psychologically devastating aspect was the complete absence of choice at every level. European princesses might at least negotiate some aspects of their marriages or express preferences about timing. Ottoman princesses discovered their fates through imperial decree. The wedding date, the husband's identity, even the specific ceremony details were determined by others and announced as accomplished facts. Historical records show that some princesses attempted various forms of resistance. They might claim illness, request delays for religious observances, or appeal directly to their fathers for different arrangements. But the imperial system had anticipated these responses. Palace physicians could evaluate claims of illness. Religious authorities could determine the validity of spiritual concerns. Even appeals to paternal affection were filtered through political advisors who evaluated requests based on their impact on imperial interests. The wedding night itself represented the final surrender of agency. Despite their legal rights to refuse consummation, the social pressure was enormous. Failure to consummate could be interpreted as rejection of the Sultan's decision, potential grounds for diplomatic incidents with the husband's allies, or evidence of unfitness for imperial responsibilities. The choice existed legally, but was practically meaningless in most circumstances. What made this system particularly cruel was how it weaponized the princesses' own privileges against them. Their superior rank meant they couldn't blame their husbands for the arrangement. Their legal protections meant they couldn't claim victimization. Their material comfort meant they couldn't argue hardship. They were trapped in golden cages of their own theoretical empowerment, unable to acknowledge even to themselves that they were victims of systematic exploitation. The palace records document case after case of princesses who approached their wedding nights with obvious distress. Some requested additional delays. Others asked for private meetings with religious authorities to discuss their spiritual concerns. A few attempted to negotiate alternative arrangements that might preserve their technical virginity while satisfying political requirements. These weren't the actions of eager brides. These were the desperate maneuvers of young women trying to maintain some control over their own bodies. The system's designers understood exactly what they were creating. Palace administrators kept detailed psychological profiles of potential husbands, evaluating not just their political utility, but their likely behavior toward imperial wives. They wanted men who would be grateful for the honor, respectful of their wives' superior status, but ultimately compliant with imperial expectations about producing heirs and maintaining appropriate relationships. This created marriages that were simultaneously privileged and oppressive, legally protected and emotionally devastating. The princesses lived in luxury, while experiencing a form of psychological captivity that was perhaps more sophisticated than anything inflicted on common prisoners. Their golden chains were real chains nonetheless, and the wedding night represented the moment when those chains became most visible, most personal, most inescapable. The empire had perfected a system that made resistance seem unreasonable, complaint appear ungrateful, and escape look impossible. They had created the perfect trap for their own daughters, and the wedding night was when that trap closed forever. The psychological manipulation extended far beyond the wedding ceremony itself. The Ottoman system had created what palace records euphemistically called adjustment periods following consummation. These weren't honeymoon phases designed for marital bonding. They were carefully monitored probationary periods where the princess's behavior, emotional state, and physical condition were evaluated by palace officials to ensure proper compliance with her new role. Newly married princesses found themselves under constant surveillance by female servants who reported directly to the Valide Sultan. Every conversation with their husbands, every meal they shared, Every night they spent together or apart was documented in reports that still exist in Ottoman archives today. These women discovered that marriage hadn't granted them privacy or intimacy. It had simply transferred their captivity from one form of imperial oversight to another. The most insidious aspect was how the system used the princess's own mothers and grandmothers as enforcers. The Valide Sultan, typically a former concubine who had successfully navigated the imperial system, became the primary authority overseeing her daughters' and granddaughters' marriages. These women understood exactly what their daughters were experiencing because they had survived similar ordeals themselves. But instead of providing comfort or advocacy, they became the primary agents ensuring compliance. Historical accounts describe heart-wrenching scenes where young princesses begged their mothers for help only to be told that resistance was futile and dangerous. The Valide Sultan would explain with the authority of experience that accepting one's fate was the only path to survival and eventual happiness. These conversations, recorded in palace memoirs, reveal how the system perpetuated itself through generations of traumatized women who had learned to see their own suffering as necessary preparation for imperial responsibility. The empire maintained detailed medical records of royal marriages, ostensibly to ensure the health of potential heirs. But these documents reveal a darker purpose. Palace physicians monitored the princess's physical and emotional responses to marital relations with clinical precision. They recorded symptoms of distress, documented resistance behaviors, and recommended interventions designed to ensure reproductive success, regardless of the princess's psychological state. Some records describe the use of herbal preparations administered to reluctant princesses. These concoctions, prepared by palace healers, were designed to reduce anxiety and increase compliance during intimate encounters. The medical justification was maintaining the princess's health and the empire's succession needs. The practical effect was drugging imperial daughters into submission when psychological pressure proved insufficient. The geographic isolation of many marriages created additional layers of psychological torture. Husbands were often assigned to distant provinces immediately after marriage, taking their new wives far from the familiar environment of the imperial capital. This wasn't coincidental administrative convenience. It was deliberate policy designed to complete the princess's separation from her support systems and force dependence on her husband's goodwill. Princess Gevan Sultan, married at age 4 to a 55-year-old governor, spent her childhood in a remote fortress, knowing that her adult life would unfold hundreds of miles from anyone who had known her as a child. The letters she wrote to her family, preserved in palace archives, describe a profound loneliness that went beyond normal homesickness. She was experiencing the systematic erasure of her previous identity, replaced by a new role as the governor's wife in a province where her imperial status meant little in daily practical terms. The economic aspects of these marriages created another form of psychological pressure. While princesses received substantial dowries and maintained theoretical control over their wealth, the practical management of these resources often fell to their husbands or male relatives. This created situations where women who were legally entitled to vast fortunes found themselves dependent on others for basic decisions about their own property. Palace financial records show numerous instances of princesses requesting permission to access their own funds for personal expenses or charitable activities. These requests required approval from multiple male authorities, including their husbands, fathers, or brothers. The message was clear. Despite their elevated status and legal protections, their agency remained subject to male oversight in every meaningful aspect of their lives. The reproductive expectations created perhaps the most invasive form of psychological pressure. Imperial marriages weren't considered successful until they produced children, preferably sons who could serve the dynasty's future needs. Palace records document the intense scrutiny applied to royal couples who failed to conceive quickly. Physicians examined both partners. Religious authorities offered prayers and remedies, and court officials speculated about potential problems. For the princesses, this meant that their most private experiences became matters of state concern. Their menstrual cycles were tracked by palace officials. Their dietary habits were regulated to optimize fertility. Their daily activities were structured around maximizing conception chances. The wedding night wasn't just the beginning of married life. It was the start of a reproductive monitoring system that would continue until menopause or death. The system's psychological sophistication becomes clear when examining how it handled princesses who successfully resisted or escaped their initial marriages. Rather than simply forcing compliance, the palace developed elaborate procedures for managing difficult daughters that were designed to break their will through administrative exhaustion rather than direct confrontation. A princess who successfully divorced her first husband might find herself subjected to increasingly unsuitable second marriage proposals. If she rejected these, she faced social isolation, reduced financial support, and constant pressure from family members who described her resistance as selfish endangerment of imperial interests. The system could afford to be patient because it controlled every aspect of the princess's environment and resources. Some princesses attempted to find refuge in religious devotion, hoping that spiritual commitment might provide an acceptable alternative to marriage. But even this escape route was carefully controlled. Religious authorities who might support a princess's desire for celibacy were themselves imperial appointees who understood that their positions depended on serving the dynasty's needs rather than individual preferences. The few princesses who successfully avoided remarriage after divorce or widowhood did so by becoming so politically valuable in other ways that their reproductive potential became secondary to their administrative usefulness. These women essentially had to prove that their minds were more valuable than their wombs, a standard that required exceptional intelligence, political skill, and favorable circumstances that most could never achieve. This systematic approach to controlling imperial women created what modern psychologists would recognize as institutionalized trauma. The princesses lived in constant awareness that their personal desires were irrelevant to their life outcomes. They learned that resistance brought increased scrutiny and pressure rather than respect for their autonomy. They discovered that even their own families viewed them primarily as imperial resources rather than individuals deserving of love and protection. The wedding night represented the culmination of this psychological conditioning, the moment when theoretical possibilities for agency dissolved into practical reality of systematic control. These women had been raised knowing this moment would come, trained to accept it, and isolated from anyone who might validate their resistance. The empire had created the perfect conditions for manufacturing consent to their own exploitation. The evidence of this systematic psychological destruction appears in the most intimate details preserved in palace records. When Fatma Sultan, daughter of Mustafa II, was informed of her engagement to Sila Dar Ali Pasha, court observers noted her immediate physical reaction. She fainted during the announcement ceremony, required medical attention, and spent the following 3 days refusing all food. Palace physicians documented her symptoms with clinical precision, describing what they termed premarital melancholy, as if it were a medical condition rather than a rational response to losing control over her own destiny. The palace developed specific protocols for managing these reactions. Princesses showing signs of distress were assigned additional female companions, given increased recreational activities, and provided with special dietary supplements believed to improve mood and compliance. But these interventions weren't designed to address the underlying cause of their distress. They were calculated to maintain the princess's health and appearance while suppressing any behaviors that might complicate the marriage proceedings. The most disturbing aspect was how the system normalized this suffering. Palace records describe these reactions using matter-of-fact language that treated princess distress as routine administrative challenges. Officials developed standardized responses to different types of resistance, creating bureaucratic procedures for processing human anguish as efficiently as they managed military supplies or tax collection. Court physicians maintained detailed catalogs of symptoms they might encounter in reluctant brides. These included loss of appetite, excessive weeping, requests for religious counsel, attempts to injure themselves in ways that might delay consummation, and what they described as excessive attachment to childhood companions. Each symptom had corresponding treatments designed not to eliminate the underlying cause, but to ensure the marriage proceeded on schedule. The system's cruelty extended to manipulating the princess's genuine religious faith against them. Islamic law provided certain protections for women in marriage, including rights that theoretically gave them some control over intimate relations. But palace religious authorities developed interpretations of these laws that emphasized duty and submission over personal autonomy. They taught the princesses that resistance to imperial marriage arrangements constituted resistance to divine will itself. Young princesses received religious instruction that framed their marriages as sacred obligations that transcended personal preference. They were told that their elevated status came with corresponding responsibilities that ordinary women didn't bear. Their wedding nights weren't just personal experiences, but acts of service to God, empire, and dynasty. This theological manipulation made resistance feel not just politically dangerous, but spiritually damning. The Ottoman Empire created the most sophisticated system of female subjugation in human history. Disguised as privilege and protection, these princesses lived in golden cages, their wedding nights marking the moment when psychological conditioning became physical reality. The empire had perfected the art of manufacturing consent to systematic exploitation, turning its own daughters into willing participants in their own captivity. Today, their stories remind us that power structures can corrupt even the most sacred human relationships, and that true freedom requires more than legal rights or material comfort. It demands the fundamental recognition that human agency cannot be negotiated away, no matter how elegant the chains or how gilded the prison.